Let's let's start. Okay, so welcome to another book talk organized by the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination. My name is Michael Lackner, and I have the honor to work as the president of the society. I will mention the other members of our board in a couple of minutes. You'll find our website here under criticaldivination.org. One word. The society was established in 2016 in the framework of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities with the title Fate, Freedom and Prognostication, Strategies of Coping with the Future in East Asia and Europe. And yes, since 2023, the Society acts as a successor to the consortium, whose funding by the German Ministry of Education ended after 14 years in 2023. During this period, we edited a book series with Brill Leiden, Prognostication in History, and the International Journal of Divination and Prognostication, also with Brill, together with the book series, which I mentioned, and the journal, the consortium, and now the Society for the Critical Study of Divination have established the research of pre-modern forms of prediction, forecasting, prognosis, briefly strategies of coping with the future as a solid consolidated field within the humanities. Now, following an idea of our colleague Dr. Li Gang, we started to stage a series of talks on the books that have been published so far. And it is my pleasure to host these talks, which we began with the most recent book in prognostication and history, and now continue with other publications that are relevant to our topic. Our talks can be found on YouTube. Voila. And the next talk is scheduled for April and will be announced on our website. Let me briefly introduce today's speakers. Both are more than familiar with our society as well as with the international consortium I just mentioned. So it's really some kind of family meeting today. Stéphanie Homola, the author of the book we will present today, is a research fellow at the CNRS and member of the French Research Institute on East Asia. She was previously director of the elite master's program, Standards of Decision-Making Across Cultures, and before a research associate at the International Consortium, both at the University of Erlangen, and we still miss her. Among her numerous publications, I will just quote a few. Chinese 8 science predictions, ontology, knowledge, and computation. Then jeu, divination, et cognition. And another one, Caught in the Language of Fate, the Quality of Destiny in Taiwan. And Ce que la main sait du destin, opération et manipulation dans les pratiques divinatoires chinoises. And this leads me to a current research project that she is conducting together with Martha Hansen, who is present here, and who is, well, we have 3 members of our society's board today. My humble self, Martha Hansen, and Stéphanie Homola. So this leads me to this current research project. Knowing hands, Chinese hand memory techniques, and knowledge in situ, comparison and contact. Martha's project will be located in Erlangen, so we will definitely have more opportunities to meet with Stéphanie in the future too. All the more since she's also, as I mentioned, a member of the board of our society. Now, today's discussant, Esther-Maria Guggenmos, is also an old acquaintance of the consortium, where she worked as a scientific coordinator for 6 years. And needless to say that we also miss her here. At present, she is professor of the history of religions at Lund University, where I had the honor to attend her inaugural lesson. Thank you so much. She has widely published on many aspects of Buddhism, both in past and present. I believe in Buddhism and traveling, on the attractiveness of denoting oneself a lay Buddhist in contemporary urban Taiwan. And her stay in Erlangen has also converted her to the study of the relation between Buddhism and divination. She wrote a contribution on this topic for the Handbook of Divination and Prognostication in China, as well as Stéphanie has done. There's another book on divining monks in Chinese Buddhism, Wahrsagende Mönche im chinesischen Buddhismus, biographies from the Shenzhen Tuan. And more recently, she has published on life education, with the title Shaping the Outlook on Life Education and Religion in Chinese Context. So far, I stop sharing. So yes, subscribe to our newsletter and join the next talk in April 2025. Okay, so far for that. Now the family meeting is open, and I would like to ask Stéphanie to share her screen. Yes. It works. And now I hand over to Stéphanie.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. I also wanted to thank the Society for the invitation, and Li Gang also, and of course Esther-Maria for discussing the book today with us. So to give an overview of the book, I would like to focus on one aspect today, which is the articulation between the ethnographic journey and the anthropological questions and how they developed together. I have actually structured the book according to this, so it follows in parallel the fieldwork, that is my gradual discovery and learning also of these practices, and also my gradual knowledge of the milieu of professionals. So in parallel with the construction of questions. So this is what I try to introduce today. So how did it all start? I became interested in divination practices in Taiwan because I was struck by the numerous and the hot conversations and rumors around fate and divination. It started in 2005 when I was teaching French to a young woman, and she spent much of our sessions recounting her experiences with divination, so swamming, the specialists she had met, and many extraordinary anecdotes. So starting from this experience, I decided to investigate these practices, and I soon ran into two complicating aspects of the question. The first is how to understand, define, and classify the huge diversity of practices, the variety of actors, techniques, and locations. So if you take the locations, for instance, you can see people practicing in the street, also diviners in posh office, in a high-end area, also in temples, in evening classes, at a community university, in tea houses. Most of the time people practice at home. You can read about it in the newspaper, you can watch TV programs, there's online divination and so on. So it's very, very diverse. Actors also are also diverse, like all kind of professional, semi-professional, non-professional, amateurs, practitioners with very diverse backgrounds from all kinds of social classes. And if you consider the techniques, it's even worse. So that was the first aspect. The second, I was struck how such complicated techniques could be so popular. So everybody in Taiwan says it's very complex, and many people are also very skeptical about it. But still, people would spend their free time, like evening, weekends, studying the 8 signs method. So what benefits do they derive from it? And what type of understanding does this knowledge unlock? So this is why I call the diversity question and the complexity question. So from these two main questions, I try to build two research questions. The first one, I developed this diversity question as the statue question. So since I am an anthropologist, I was interested in the vernacular categories, that is how the Taiwanese themselves classify or consider these practices. So which intellectual and institutional categories do these practices belong to? Is it religion, superstition, science, pseudoscience, psychology, traditional culture, and so on? So the underlying question is about the legitimacy, so the status of these practices in Taiwanese society. The second question is I kind of developed this complexity question into the knowledge question. So what kind of knowledge do people derive from these practices? And what are the mechanisms that produce this knowledge? And the hypothesis that I develop in the book is that these divinatory systems are interpretative tools to act in the social world. So now I come to the fieldwork and the book of and the structure of the book. So how did I investigate? So everyone talks about divination in Taiwan, as you probably all know, it's very common. Everyone has experienced it. But at the same time, the techniques are very complex and the milieu of the specialist is quite closed. So I started with the easy part, so the so-called client. And later I will discuss I don't really like this term actually, using the word client. So I began by interviewing people about their experiences of consulting diviners. I also attended consultations. I analyzed two things mainly. First, the discourses on Xuanming that show a spectrum of opinion on fate and fate calculation. So my aim was to trace the genesis of the beliefs, or rather the strong skepticism, which lead people to consult a diviner. Second, I also wanted to trace their consultation experiences, how they engage in a learning process, on how this technique can enhance their self-knowledge, but also their attention and adaptation to their environment. So that was the first step, the clients. Then when I started to know better about the vocabulary of divination, I could approach specialists. I tried to understand the history and building of the milieu in Taiwan with the strong influence of Japan and also of mainland China after 1949. So that is the collective history of the milieu and also the strategies that the specialists use to legitimize their knowledge against accusations of superstition. So this includes their efforts to standardize the knowledge to get official recognition. Then I took also the case of one specialist with whom I worked. So this is one individual history, but it shows how most specialists in Taiwan began to take an interest in these techniques after they experienced some kind of misfortune. So they had the desire to understand why all this misfortune happened to them, what they could have done about it, and what they can still do about it. So this is a major incentive for, I would say, the huge majority of specialists to get trained in these techniques. Then I came to the first step, which is the most complicated one, the techniques themselves. So I worked with a teacher and I also learned different techniques myself. And in the book, I explain how the two main techniques that I use in Taiwan today work. That is the Bazi method, the 8-sign method, and the Weidoshu method. And I examine these two techniques and the mechanisms through which the horoscope is used as a tool for modeling and interpreting the social world, and was a resource as a consequence for decision making. I try to show how the horoscope models a network that is centered on the individual and that put into the relationship that can be either positive or negative to the person. And this allows the person to apprehend very diverse situations, mostly uncertain situations, and to try to make the most of the circumstances, depending on their own strengths and weaknesses. So after I covered these three main areas, I went on to explore the diversity of political and social context, and I extended the fieldwork to the mainland. So the fourth chapter is about the fieldwork in Beijing. It's about the social diversity of practitioners and their very diverse relationships with the state. Some professional diviners elaborate arguments and training programs, like collective training programs, to claim the official recognition of fate calculation, including in the field of national studies and Guoshui, which this is one of the categories that they mobilize. But on the opposite, I also worked with an itinerant street fortune teller And he derives a form of legitimacy precisely from the fact that he's a marginal and he's excluded from official knowledge. So here we can see these two aspects and two ways to claim a form of legitimacy. The last chapter is about fieldwork in Kaifeng, so far away from the capital. And there my interest moved from professional diviners to amateur diviners who use simplified forms of divination in their daily life. So there is a sharp contrast with the efforts by the professional and learned diviners, be it in Beijing or Taipei, who try to institutionalize standardized forms of teaching. In Kaifeng, on the opposite, the transmission is carried out through the personal relationship between friends, or sometimes called a master and a student, but mostly the vocabulary of friendship is used. So it revolves around so-called fated affinity, Yuanfen, journeys of initiation, and the sharing of legends and skills. So in this kind of friendly relationship, it is not so important to pass on quality knowledge. Like they don't really care about if they transmit like the real or authentic knowledge about these techniques. What is important is how this knowledge and these skills are appropriated in personal ways and how they are used efficiently in daily life. So in conclusion, I wanted to go back to my initial questions. So first, diversity. So I realized that diversity at many levels is not just a characteristic of Swanming, but it's actually constitutive of these practices. So first, the diversity of conceptions of fate. So if you remember, my initial interest was raised by rumors and conversations about Swanming and fate. And I realized actually quite late in the research that this was not just a side phenomenon, but it's actually at the heart of the concept of fate. So fate is not a precise notion that would exist in the collective imagination or that people would know once and for all. And I understood through these rumors and conversation that this notion or this various notion that people have about fate is constructed and it circulates through these rumors and conversations. So it manifests not through definition that people would know, like people wouldn't tell you, oh, fate is this and this, but it's manifests through stories. So they would tell you stories about fate. They would not elaborate about what exactly fate is, but you're supposed to get it through stories, through example of extraordinary things that happen. Second, the diversity of actors. So this client-specialist dichotomy that is often the starting point or something that we often hear about is actually very superficial. I would rather see it as a continuum of knowledge, a learning process. So all kind of people having all kind of understanding and level of knowledge of these techniques. And when we talk about practitioners, the vast majority is not the professionals, but the amateurs who don't consider themselves fortune tellers, of course. Just people who are interested in it, like the Gao I Ching or Gao Swanming, this kind of thing. So they practice usually starting for themselves. And then when people gradually know that they have this knowledge, they would practice for family and friends. Third, the diversity of techniques. So the fact that divinatory knowledge resists uniformization, I think it's a direct consequence of two things. So one is a specific historical and ideological context that is the construction of superstitions. So what I call a political skepticism. But more fundamentally, I think this also stems from what I call a structural skepticism, and kind of internal skepticism, which is constituent of the dynamic of these practices and learning. And this dynamic can only be set in motion through personal and highly individualized encounters with fate and elaboration of what fate is and what fate calculation can bring to people. So this is a kind of irony. So I've met many professionals in Taiwan and China who made huge efforts to try to standardize their knowledge, going beyond, the hundreds of schools and endless debates about the techniques and how to apply them and so on. But my impression is that it is as if they did not realize that what appealed to people exactly is exactly that it is not standardized. It is because there are all kinds of techniques, all kinds of practitioners, and ways to practice in all kinds of social contexts. So this is what I call the irony of standardization. So this is the diversity question that I raised at the beginning. And the second one, if you remember, is the complexity question. So why does it appeal to so many people despite the complexity? And in some ways, this is still a mystery, something that I'm still investigating. So we know that Chinese cosmology, so on which all divination techniques are based, we all know that it is difficult to memorize and to manipulate. So this is something that everybody experiences. So the idea is to investigate if there are ways to facilitate the transmission, learning, and application of this knowledge. And if yes, if there are means to do so, how does this favor the development of certain cognitive qualities, such as memorization and computation? So this is how I introduced this current project that we are developing with Martha Hansen, that we called Knowing Hands, based on what Martha has coined as hand mnemonics. That is how to rely on the hands to facilitate memorization, computation, and also the application of a certain type of knowledge, including divination, but not limited to it. So we know that historically these techniques have been used in China since the 7th century in Buddhist ritual practices, and later they developed and extended to other fields such as mathematics, music, poetry, military art, and law, and so on. And today, the hand is used in this way to memorize and apply knowledge in Chinese medicine, in rituals, Taoist rituals mainly, and a lot also in divinatory practices in everyday life. And despite the similarities that we can see between these hand diagrams you can see here, but also the practice itself. So this has never been studied as a common practice. So this is our hypothesis with Martha, is that there is something common there. So the aim of this project is to explore how this cognitive use of the hand expanded or declined over time in this field, and also to understand what do these different types of knowledge, so including divination, do they have in common that explains that they can be modeled in a similar way. So this is what we call handy knowledge. So what kind of knowledge is grasped in this way with the hands? So we examine these practices from 3 angles. So these are the what you can see in the subtitles. In situ means an historical ethnographic approach in China with extension to Japan and Korea. In comparison means comparison with the European tradition of arts of memory, where we can find similar practices. And third, in contact means in Sino-European intercultural context. So as you can see, this is still, I would say, a follow-up of my research that started a long time ago about divination practices in Taiwan and China. So exploring this complexity aspect that is still, in some ways, a mystery. So thank you for your attention. I think I'll stop here and we can start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stéphanie. I mean, both for the presentation of your book and for the outlook, the perspective of your future research, which will be conducted with Martha. May I hand over to Esther-Maria now? We are very curious for your comments.
Thank you so much. First, thank you for inviting me. For me, it was really interesting to read your monograph there, Stephanie. And in the beginning, I thought, wow, that's a lot of pages. That's a small script. What? How am I going about it? And will I really read every page? And I wrote also a review for our journal about it. And once I had started, I really got more and more drawn into it. It is beautiful, and I can really recommend it for all of you to read it, not only for the specialists, but also for a more general audience. And that is not easy to do with such a special topic, right? Which has a lot of technical details where you easily can lose yourself in getting deeply into some here and there sub-branches, kind of finding good ways how to analyze that is needs an anthropologist in the best sense. And that is what some way, was also just for me a delightful reading experience. I, on the one hand, could see that you had a long exposure to the field, that you also some way profited from being in Taiwan and without any political constraints. One just can immerse into it. One can see how they all move about it. One can ask about the details. There is no special caution. And it fits well that you take these first 3 chapters of the book and complement it with all the experience you gain there in Taiwan and make it a very saturated reading experience where we can bring all the elements together, learn more about clients, learn more about the ones who divine by themselves, and learn about how it works. Also, this, I feel, is a neat way of approaching it, of dissecting it, and also starting with the clients and not starting with the diviners or the arts and then writing a complicated book about Ziwei Doushu, where we also don't have a lot of material about, but putting that back to the appendix and focusing a bit on what does it really mean to practice divination, to live divination, to have divination as a natural element among social cultural practices? And that is a kind of convincing, I feel. And thanks for that. In the beginning also, you have, and that is not self-evident for anthropological approaches, you bring in historical background knowledge. That is really a plus, I feel, especially with these long-grown techniques where we have a very specialized vocabulary, very specialized practices. It is very, very helpful from time to time that you are able to draw these larger lines. Maybe that is also a bit profiting from what we did there in Erlangen, because we had specialists. We had specialists on early China, and we know something about Wang Chong. And maybe it makes it more easy also to cross the centuries and to bring different dynasties, different thoughts. Also this, from the beginning, already very critical engagement with divination into this broader discussion. So that is something very convincing when one goes into it. And for the one who is some way starting to get into what it means to do divination in East Asia, it is also nice to have, on the one hand, this introduction, where I get a practical imagination what happens, but I also get a lovely overview about literature. And it is not only English and a little bit of Chinese complementing it. It has also French. It has European literature and international literature in it in the best sense. So in some way, it shines through that there is great expertise in Paris, as I also know through numerous conferences where I traveled over. But many people whom you mentioned have also been in Erlangen. And so brings these worlds together and in some way that is, of course, more delightful for me to read because I know all these people. But for the ones who want to get an overview about the field, this introduction works well. So I can even give it to my students who are of course, they would like to learn about divination, not only East Asian divination in history of religions. We cross go around the globe and have a lot of expertise also on European forms of divination here. But this is something that I can pass on even to a beginner to get a first overview about what topics are we working on when we talk about divination in East Asia. Then what also might be really appealing to the one who is having a first visit into divination, but also the one who is a bit more experienced, is how you take us on journeys with these diviners. You don't get us in a deep explanation on ethical challenges accompanying a bit strange men in maybe a bit under unlikely circumstances, but we see how you managed in some way, and at the same time we suddenly stand in front of the bookshelf of such a diviner, and I remember myself, I also look at this and I say, sorry, I don't understand really what he's doing there, and the big classics don't drop immediately, and then you kind of decipher that. So that is something I enjoyed a lot when reading that. Congratulations on bringing that with the hand mnemonics even a step further, making a project out of it. I feel there you really have a point. It's a fresh angle to look at that, to also look through this lens of how we are working with the hand, very much in line with how we after the cultural turn in religious studies now try to approach subjects, right? We have a lot of focus on material culture, on aesthetics, on sensation, and the hands are perfect. A great lens for looking at that. So I'm looking forward towards what will be out there for us in the future. And now I should ask maybe some questions, or we should get into certain topics where you might even beyond the several hundred pages you wrote know a bit more, or lead us into even greater depth. I made a couple of notes with regard to that, and there is on the one hand a bit more of general questions, and finally I'm also of course interested what's the case with Buddhism and how many Buddhist diviners and whatever, right? But let me start a bit more with a general impression. I mean, your fieldwork, as far as I got it, was also a bit more than 10 years ago. We now in the past decade have experienced a more and more restricted religious policy. Many religious communities struggle. And I wonder a little bit in how far the climate among diviners is also changing, in how far we see maybe more hesitance, less vigorous developments, a bit kind of holding back, or whether there is different strata of society that might react differently. And I don't know whether you would like to react directly to that, or whether I just pose another 2-3 questions and then you have all the freedom. What would you prefer, Stéphanie?
Maybe I can react now, if
okay.
it's fine. Yeah. So thank you very much first for your comment. So you're right. The field work, well, I conducted it mainly in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and we know how mainland China changed in early 2010s.
Mm.
So in this way, the book is already a kind of historical document because it documents this period, which was a period of freedom, I would say, and openness for diviners. And I try to document it, from the early 80s. So this still need to be done in more details. But from the early 80s, there have been some, up and downs for diviners, depending on religious policies, also on local, national levels. So there were there were some periods with more restriction and some that were more open. So definitely the late 2000, early 2010s was a period of openness. And this is where I really witnessed the change from the beginning of my fieldwork and the end. So the last year I'm documenting in China was 2011. And in the two previous years, I have really seen how the practitioners became more and more visible in public space. So this was the time where around, the Lama Temple, the Confucius Temple in Beijing, you could see so many offices, posters advertising diviners and so on. And I know there've been some crackdown there had been some crackdown in the past, for instance, during the Olympics, but then the diviners would come back. But then after, in the mid 2010s, things changed, I think, quite radically. And now we're definitely in a period of more restriction. And so I've not been back to Beijing recently, but what I've heard is that the landscape is quite different in these areas. The diviners are much less visible, and I've heard from friends and people I know there that the pressure on diviners is stronger and stronger, like in usual not clear threat, but rather rumors about things that can happen to diviners. So this brings a kind of self-restriction, like rumors about the closing of websites dedicated to divination and so on. So people get more and more conscious. And so this is the reality now. And so maybe this will change again in the future and for, a better or more relaxed policies. But at the moment, this is what I'm describing in Beijing is quite different nowadays. About Taiwan, I would say I don't see such an evolution. Of course, it's very different.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I still remember when we started the IKGF with our early advisory board members, there was this suggestion we could go to China and some way make portraits or document old diviners. Joji said there would be a generation of diviners kind of dying out. From reading your book, I didn't have that much of an impression that it's a kind of art that is slowly, losing its basis, its wisdom, and so would you see that there is still an old generation around among diviners?
There was back then, but these people were already old, very old. But as you said, I don't have the impression that the knowledge is getting lost because there is a lot of transmission going on. And of course, at all levels, and I think it's always been the case, a lot of renovation or invention, and this diversity I mentioned in the talk today is fully there, and I think it would be probably a fallacy to think that the kind of authentic knowledge is being lost, and I don't think it's the case. It's always renewing. And so, as you said, so many people interested, really, so many at all levels, like from the amateur to the professional. So I don't think this is losing ground. It is losing ground for sure in official circles, but in the at the Minjan level, it's still very strong and popular.
That is really good to hear. Sometimes I thought, hey, have we missed a chance to record all this good old knowledge? And from reading your book and now from hearing you, I would say, yeah, this is a living tradition, and it has survived such a lot of political challenges in the 20th century. It might also find ways to go about current ones. Another question that when reading your book came to my mind was the question of gender. you have in between some female diviners. I would say there's more male ones than female ones in my impression when reading it, but I didn't count them. And sometimes it was also that I didn't even note that we are now having a female one when reading it. And I thought, oh, okay, this was a female. Did we have another female one before? Sometimes through these more gender-informed approaches, we get we have a special emphasis now in thinking about is there a difference in how divinatory arts are lived, and are certain techniques more for the females or for the males? Would you say a gender-specific analysis would bring still other things to the surface if you would look through this at your book? Or would you say, hey, this is not a central category through which we can see things?
Well, I think it's very relevant. And I didn't really engage with the topic, but I talked about it when I mentioned the transformation of the practices in Taiwan starting in 1980s. So as I think you all know, the elite level of the practices, or the elitist practices, were mostly men, most of them stemming from the literature, right? But when the Taiwanese started to appropriate the techniques after they had been trained mostly by mainlanders, so people or practitioners coming from the mainland in 49, so they started to appropriate the techniques, and they had this project to modernize this knowledge, including to standardize it and so on. And one aspect of this appropriation was that more and more women started to get interested and started to get trained. And there was this famous practitioner in the 80s and 90s, Huixin Jaiju, I think her name is, who became very famous in Taiwan because she popularized the Zewei method, digging up an old way to draw the horoscope that was very telling, and this could be understood more easily. So she was one of the first, and then we saw later more and more female diviners. So I would say this goes along this rationalization and modernization, or rather popularization, that took place starting in Taiwan in the 1980s and mostly 90s. The idea to bring these practices or to make them available to more people and to non-specialists. So this is where the do-it-yourself manual started to be published in Taiwan. And some of them were published also by female practitioners. So nowadays, I would say there's a mix of male and female practitioners in fate calculation. But you mentioned this divide is actually an old anthropological divide that we can see, I think, in many societies, where the more elite practices were practiced by men. So in the case of China, this is, the fate calculation aspect, and the more so-called popular ways of divining, including inspired divination, through medium and so on, were more female. So this is also one reason of this divide. But things are changing. Although I think in mainland China and also in Taiwan, the majority is still male, but there are more and more women.
That would also be the case for the one Taiwanese diviner that I'm regularly visiting, because he's practicing this one dice ritual that I've been following up over the centuries, and that I'm still quite fascinated by in its practice and in its philosophical argumentations also. So yeah, when I'm thinking a little bit about that Buddhist diviner, I would say Buddhism for him is, on the one hand, something that gives him a larger reference, especially when it comes to economic aspects. He would say, you can make a donation to Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva. So it's some way different from asking, give me some donation or pay for what I'm doing, my service here, but you're always engaging with that Bodhisattva. That was the first observation he did. And he is also using Buddhism as a kind of a corrective in order to explain an ancient techniques like this divination ritual. He would say, hey, it is in some way deficient in its translation. And when I apply a broader spirit of Buddhism, of compassion, I can read this original text in a different light. So I would see two main functions in which he actually uses Buddhism in order to make divination even more enjoyable, practicable for his community. Is this something you also would see? On which occasions have you seen Buddhism coming in as a resource? I saw it in some of the biographies shining through. I saw some Buddhists in your book here and there, and I thought, is it possible to draw a bit of a bigger picture? What role does Buddhism play within these divinatory contexts?
Yeah, I think it's quite a complex question. What I can answer is that when this first part of my research, when I worked on the discourse of people about their practices, something that I heard very often is that, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I should not consult the divine, I should not believe in those things. So this is a common discourse that Buddhism officially, the doctrine is not supporting this kind of practices. So this is something people are aware of. Then two aspects, I think, two aspects. One is about the practitioners. So I try this is one aspect I try to investigate, is the relationship between these practices and Taoism and Taoist specialists and Buddhist specialists. And what I could observe is that there's no, I would say, doctrine about it, but rather individuals. So in almost all temples, like be they Taoist or Buddhist or popular religion, you cannot really identify or mixed. There's almost always one individual. So it may be a Taoist monk or a Buddhist one who is known for being skilled at failed calculation. But to my knowledge, this is not something that is, linked or this is not linked to Buddhism in particular or to Taoism in particular. So these persons are known for these skills and they are consulted. So people would go to the temple specifically to see this Buddhist monk or this Taoist monk because they know he's skilled in Bazi, Zewei-doshu, and so on. And so I never worked specifically with such Buddhist monk, for instance, so I cannot go into details. And I don't know if this person, what kind of discourse this person have to reconciliate, the Buddhist doctrine, the official condemnation of divination, and their practice. So that's the first aspect, the individuals. The second aspect is something that you can see with secular practitioners, like non-religious specialists, the usual failed calculation specialists, the one I worked with mainly, is that you can have all kind of ethical discourses because the techniques themselves do not include ethical discourse. So there is no specific moral discourse about something should be done or not, something is good or not. So usually the specialists, they combine the techniques with another ethical discourse that can have their diverse origin, for instance, from the Buddhist tradition, the Christian tradition, also a Confucianist tradition, and most of the time they mixed all of them. But something that really surprised me that I learned from studying the techniques themselves is that they are amoral, like they do not include any ethical message, and that this is why the way a specific individual elaborated discourse will be a mix of these techniques and his own interpretation. This is also why it is so diverse. And it is not rare. I think we have one study quite old that documented one such specialist who was, a secular failed calculation specialist, but also a Buddhist believer, and he combined the two to and even said that the more you practice divination and at the same time enhancing your Buddhist meditation and Buddhist knowledge, then you should be able to you won't need the techniques themselves anymore. I mean the technique anymore, and you will only rely on your Buddhist practice. So this is something that I've come across quite often. So this is why this is so individualized also. So I don't know if I give you some elements, but I think this will deserve probably a whole study, only focusing on Buddhist specialists.
But this is exactly precisely the interesting aspect. I mean, that is what you mentioned. It's highly personalized, and no standardization, no statistics, by the way, needed, because it's all about one case, one special question, one special life also. So this life sort of this life's evolution, is a story, of course. So it is clear that rather stories will be mentioned when it comes to the definition of fate, which is not really possible. And also very interesting that it is your personal misfortune or a crisis that leads you to to practice these arts or to become interested in these arts. So phenomena science cannot explain, for instance, like I remember that, in 1895, I think, the missionary W.H.P. Martin edited a journal which was called Recherche, well, collections about science, and that was the word for that. And there was a message, a letter written to the editor by a Chinese scholar who said, "Oh, finally, I have understood, how lightning and thunder work together, and I know something about electricity. But recently, my brother has been struck by lightning. Can you explain this?" And this is again the aspect. So now I'm really happy that when Zhao Lu and I started with the edition of our handbook, we started, in fact, with the definition of divination as a very, very important cultural practice. And I'm glad to see the field broadened by now, and really happy about that. I would have one question, but that is to both speakers. How do you see the function or the functioning even of secrecy in in the practice of these arts, and in the relationship between the clients and the practitioners? Because here we have a center which is called Alternative Rationalities and Esoteric Practices, and there's a lot about. I mean, we hear a lot of talks about this the question of secrecy, but almost never in relation with divination. So that would be a question addressed to both of you.
Thank you. If I can try to answer, maybe I could make a distinction between these, two kind of professionals I mentioned. So the professional who are, embedded in a milieu, very complex milieu with schools and so on, and the amateurs. So for the professional, I think that probably the secrecy is important because this is the basis for their the special skills, and the fact that they have disadvantage compared to the people who don't know the techniques. So secrecy is protecting their trade. But what is interesting is that we also find this kind of secrecy in amateurs. And so this, what I could observe in Kaifeng is that, so these people, they don't make a living. They don't care that, they don't earn money, but still they were insisting. So for instance, when one of them was teaching me a specific technique, they would always say, oh, don't reveal it to anyone. This is very important. And I realized that one reason is not that it was, so it was because there was a discrepancy between the technique that may be quite easy to learn and to teach and the underlying power that it would give you in the world. And I think the rationale behind was that if you would just explain it to, like an easygoing way to anybody, then they would say, oh, this is it. Nothing special, not so important. But actually, you need like years of practice and understanding to see how good it is and what you can really get from it. And I think this is something that is very common also in Taoism, is the fact that if you like reveal secret knowledge, they may look simple to people who don't have, the background. So it was very interesting to see that even these amateurs who don't gain anything from it, they would be very careful that the secrecy is kept to kind of preserve the value of these techniques.
In spite of the do-it-yourself handbooks, of course. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and this is very interesting also. Yeah, of course, this dichotomy with the do-it-yourself. But what was interesting is that these people in Kaifeng, they didn't know these do-it-yourself manuals would exist. This is the kind of things you find in Taipei or in Beijing.
I'm curious for Esther-Maria's take on that.
Yeah, there is similarities, I would say, with this group that I'm observing there. I would say that the diviner himself has reached a stage in his life where he would like to pass on his knowledge, maybe have somebody who is following up him later. So he kind of is encouraging everybody to learn about it. And on the one hand, there might be a silent hope to find a talented student. But on the other hand, it is also for him a way to show how much more it takes to be a diviner than to know the simple arts. So you can get an instruction class with him, you can make your own dice, and you can discuss results. He has a student group and he says, oh, try it on each other and get some training, and he would encourage that a lot. And then while you experience how poor you are in interpreting these results and linking them through to your own life in a meaningful way, you're kind of stunned by his interpretations, who, without even less knowledge about yourself, are able to make some meaningful advice how to handle your future. So he kind of has both spheres in his practitioner group, I would say. And the notion of secrecy is not there for the simple technique. That he would say, hey, this is all very simple because fate is just there, right? And we can understand it, and has it works, has its mechanics, but it needs expertise. It needs also me as a diviner to make sense out of that. And that is where it's also good to know your own abilities and not to overestimate yourself. So this kind of be cautious and learn what is appropriate for you, and do also what is appropriate for you, and leave to the diviner what belongs to the diviner, and give also the diviner the appropriate donation for this art that you are not able to perform by yourself, is kind of cultivated in that group, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a tension, between, let me say, the openness on the one hand and secrecy on the other hand. But that is also a perfect characteristic, of course, of some kinds of religion, right? I mean, and some kinds of esotericism. So time is over. Thank you so much. And I hope to see all of you very soon in the future. Thanks so much for joining us. And we will hopefully meet very soon. Thank you.